There's a specific thing that happens after a conflict, even a small one. Not during it. After. When it's technically over, when the words have been said and the door has closed or the phone call has ended. You don't want to talk. You don't want to be comforted. You don't want to explain yourself or be asked how you're feeling. You want to disappear. Not from the person you fought with, from everyone. Friends who had nothing to do with it. Family who don't even know it happened. The colleague who texts asking about something completely unrelated. All of it feels like too much. All of it feels like something you don't have access to right now. Most people interpret this as a mood, as being upset or hurt or needing space in some vague emotional sense. But what's actually happening is more specific than that, and more neurological than emotional. The brain, after a significant conflict, enters a state that researchers have started calling social withdrawal. And understanding why it happens, mechanistically, changes the way you relate to yourself and the people around you after a fight. What conflict does to the nervous system. To understand why social withdrawal follows conflict, you first need to understand what conflict does to the body before it's over. Interpersonal conflict, argument, confrontation, significant disagreement, activates the threat response system. The amygdala registers social conflict as a threat signal. Cortisol and adrenaline are released. The sympathetic nervous system engages. Heart rate increases. Breathing becomes shallower. Cognitive resources are redirected toward the conflict itself, toward processing the threat, preparing responses, monitoring the other person's behavior for signals of escalation or resolution. This is the same system that activates in response to physical danger. The brain does not cleanly distinguish between a predator and an angry partner. The threat detection architecture is the same. The physiological response is the same. What changes when the conflict ends is not that this response immediately deactivates. The nervous system does not have an off switch that triggers the moment raised voices stop. It has a gradual de-escalation process, the parasympathetic nervous system slowly reasserting itself, cortisol levels gradually declining, heart rate returning to baseline over minutes or hours. During this de-escalation window, the brain is in a specific state. Threat system still partially activated. Cognitive resources still partially allocated to conflict processing. Social engagement capacity significantly reduced. This is the neurological substrate of wanting to disappear, not a mood, a state. The social engagement system and why it goes offline. Psychiatrist and neuroscientist Stephen Porges developed what he called polyvagal theory, a framework for understanding how the autonomic nervous system regulates social behavior. Central to this framework is what Porges calls the social engagement system, a set of neural circuits regulated primarily through the vagus nerve that controls the capacity for safe social connection. When this system is active, the face is expressive, the voice is modulated for social communication, the ears are tuned to the frequency range of human speech, and the body is oriented toward connection. When the threat response system activates, as it does during conflict, the social engagement system is suppressed. The same neural architecture cannot run both simultaneously. The brain prioritizes threat response over social connection because evolutionarily, resolving the threat takes precedence over maintaining the relationship. What this means in practice. After a significant conflict, the social engagement system does not immediately come back online when the conflict ends. It comes back online gradually as the threat response de-escalates. Until it does, social interaction of any kind, even with people entirely unrelated to the conflict, requires more effort than it normally would, because the neural infrastructure for effortless social connection is not yet fully available. The person who texts you an hour after your fight asking if you want to grab dinner is not receiving a cold response because you're angry at them. They're receiving a cold response because your brain is still running threat response software that doesn't have bandwidth for social warmth right now. Why it extends to people who weren't involved. This is the part that confuses people most, including the person experiencing it. After a fight with a partner, you don't want to talk to your best friend. After a conflict at work, you cancel plans with your family. After an argument that had nothing to do with them, the people you love most feel somehow unreachable. The explanation is physiological, not relational. The threat response system that activates during conflict is not targeted. It does not suppress social engagement selectively toward the person you fought with. It suppresses social engagement broadly, because in the ancestral environment where these systems evolved, a threat within the social group was a signal that the social environment as a whole was potentially unsafe. Research by psychologist James Gross at Stanford on emotion regulation after conflict found that the cognitive resources required for emotional regulation, for managing the residue of a conflict, processing what happened, and returning to baseline, directly compete with the resources available for social engagement. The brain cannot fully do both simultaneously. Social withdrawal after conflict is, in part, the nervous system protecting cognitive resources for the regulatory work that needs to happen before social connection can resume normally. This is why solitude after conflict often doesn't feel like loneliness, it feels like necessity. The nervous system is not seeking connection because it is actively engaged in a different task, one that connection would interrupt. The recharge that isn't really recharging. There's a specific trap that many people fall into during post-conflict social withdrawal that makes the state last longer than it needs to. The withdrawal feels like rest. It presents itself as recovery. And so the response is often to do things that feel restful: scrolling, passive consumption, low-effort distraction. These activities don't require social engagement, which is why they feel accessible when social engagement doesn't. But they also don't complete the regulatory work the nervous system is actually trying to do. Research on stress recovery, including work by stress researcher Dirk Hansen and studies from the field of affective neuroscience, suggest that the physiological de-escalation after threat activation is accelerated by specific conditions. Physical movement, which metabolizes the stress hormones that have been released. Genuine rest, meaning low stimulation states that allow the parasympathetic system to fully reassert itself, and paradoxically, brief low-stakes social contact, which activates the vagal pathways that signal safety. Scrolling does none of these. It provides distraction without resolution, keeping the nervous system occupied without completing the de-escalation process. The withdrawal extends because the conditions for genuine recovery are not being met, even though the behavior feels like recovery. Stephen Porges, describing the aftermath of interpersonal conflict, has noted that the capacity to re-engage socially after threat activation is not primarily a matter of willpower or emotional maturity. It is a matter of nervous system state. You cannot talk yourself into social warmth when the neural infrastructure for social warmth is offline. You can wait for it to come back. You can create conditions that accelerate its return. But the timeline is physiological, not volitional. This reframing has a specific implication for how people relate to themselves and to each other after a fight. The urge to disappear after a conflict is not withdrawal. It is not coldness. It is not a sign that the relationship is damaged beyond what was said. It is the nervous system doing exactly what it was designed to do, redirecting resources toward resolving a threat, suppressing systems that aren't needed for that task, and gradually, in its own time, returning to a state where connection is possible again. The people you couldn't reach during that window weren't lost. The warmth you couldn't access wasn't gone. The system was just busy, and it was always going to come back. Mind translator, psychology translated clearly.